The golden autumn sun bathed the quiet streets of Charleston, South Carolina, in a soft glow. The crisp air carried the scent of salt from the nearby harbor, blending with the faint aroma of jasmine that clung to the historic homes lining Trad Street. Inside our Victorian-style house, I moved quickly through my morning routine, the clatter of dishes and the hum of the coffee maker filling the kitchen. I had always loved our home, the warm wooden floors, the high ceilings, the antique furniture that gave it character. It was a place filled with memories of love, laughter, and security. But lately, something felt off. "Mom, is Dad coming to my game today?" I turned from the counter, my heart tightening at the hopeful look in Oliver's hazel eyes. My son, my bright and kind-hearted 11-year-old, stood at the doorway in his soccer uniform, adjusting the sleeves of his jersey. His messy brown hair stuck up at odd angles, and his cheeks were still flushed from sleep. I hesitated. I already knew the answer. Well, I forced a smile, pretending to focus on tucking a peanut butter and jelly sandwich into his lunchbox. "Dad's been really busy lately, but I'll be there, okay?" Oliver nodded, but the disappointment in his eyes was unmistakable. He was used to it by now. My husband, Daniel, had once been a devoted father, the kind who never missed a single game, who spent weekends helping Oliver practice at the park, who tucked him in at night with stories about adventure and bravery. But those days felt like a lifetime ago. 6 months had passed since Daniel's mother, Margaret, died, and with her passing, our family life had unraveled. Her death had driven a wedge between Daniel and his twin brother, Caleb, a respected doctor at Charleston General Hospital. Before, they had been inseparable, two sides of the same coin. But after the inheritance dispute, their relationship shattered. Margaret had left the majority of her estate to Caleb, and Daniel had never forgiven him for it. And just like that, my husband became a stranger. At first, I told myself it was just grief. But grief doesn't explain secret phone calls, late nights at the office, or unexplained expenses on luxury items. Grief doesn't explain why a man who once treasured his family now barely spoke to us. I watched as Oliver shouldered his soccer bag, his small hands tightening around the straps. I hated how much he had learned to accept disappointment. I glanced at the clock, 8 a.m. It was time for school. I hugged Oliver tightly, pressing a kiss to his forehead before sending him off. Then, I grabbed my keys and headed to the secret garden, my flower shop in the heart of the historic district. The shop had always been my sanctuary, a place where I could lose myself in the beauty of fresh blooms and the soothing rhythm of arranging flowers. But today, even surrounded by their soft fragrance, I felt a heavy unease settle in my chest. Something wasn't right. I had been ignoring the signs for too long. Daniel's absences, his distant gaze, the way he checked his phone constantly, as if waiting for a message he didn't want me to see. And then there was the biggest warning sign of all, Caleb. Unlike Daniel, Caleb had stayed close, watching over Oliver and me like a guardian angel. He saw the changes in Daniel, too. Just a few weeks ago, after one of Oliver's games, he had pulled me aside. "Emily, something isn't right with Daniel. I can feel it, and I think you do, too." I had laughed it off then, told him he was just being overprotective. But now, as I stood in my flower shop, my hands trembling as I wrapped a bouquet of white lilies, his words rang in my ears. Something was wrong, and deep inside, I knew it was only going to get worse. The days following Margaret's passing had felt like a slow unraveling, a quiet but relentless storm that tore through our home, leaving behind only cold silence and distance. At first, I had blamed grief. Losing a mother was painful, and I wanted to believe that was why Daniel had changed. That was why he had started coming home late, why he barely spoke during dinner, why he seemed like he was always somewhere else, even when he was right in front of me. But as weeks turned into months, I could no longer ignore the truth. Something was wrong. Daniel's relationship with his twin brother, Caleb, had completely disintegrated after the will was read. Margaret had left the majority of her wealth and properties to Caleb. Her reasoning had been simple. Caleb had taken care of her during her final years, while Daniel had been too consumed by his work. But Daniel saw it as betrayal. His bitterness turned into obsession. Every night, I would hear him on the phone, his voice hushed but urgent. I couldn't make out the words, but his tone sent a chill down my spine. He was planning something. Then, there were the money withdrawals. Daniel had always liked nice things, but lately, his spending had spiraled out of control. Designer suits, high-end watches, luxury colognes, things that seemed out of place for a grieving man. One evening, I found a receipt tucked between the pages of a book in his office. My stomach twisted as I read it. $5,200, an expensive bracelet from a high-end jeweler. But I never received a bracelet. When I confronted him, Daniel didn't even blink. It's for a client, he said coolly. A business gift. A lie. And then there was his phone. It never left his side. Even at night, he kept it face down on his bedside table. If I so much as glanced at it, he tensed up. One night, I woke up around 2 a.m. to find him missing from our bed. I padded downstairs, my heartbeat quickening, and stopped when I saw a faint light glowing from his office. He was on the phone. I stayed in the shadows, holding my breath. Yes, Daniel said in a low, controlled voice. I know what I'm doing. Just trust me. It'll all be handled soon. A long pause. Then, she won't be a problem anymore. The air was sucked from my lungs. Who was he talking about? And then, for the first time since this nightmare began, I felt afraid of my own husband. A familiar presence in the dark. While Daniel had grown colder, Caleb had become more present. He had always been kind. But lately, it was like he could sense the shift in my world. He had taken Oliver under his wing, showing up for soccer games, offering to help with homework, inviting us out for lunch. One night, after Oliver's game, Caleb caught me alone in the parking lot. Emily, he said, his voice low but firm. I need to ask you something. I swallowed hard. What is it? He hesitated before speaking, as if choosing his words carefully. Has Daniel changed? I froze. Of course, he's changed, I said, forcing a laugh. His mother just died. He's dealing with a lot. Caleb held my gaze. I don't mean grief, Emily. His expression darkened. I mean, something else. Something worse. I opened my mouth to brush it off, but then I saw the concern in his eyes. The same concern I had been feeling but didn't dare say out loud. Has he been spending a lot of money? Caleb pressed. Acting secretive? Staying out late? I felt nauseous. He knew. I didn't want to admit it. But the words tumbled out before I could stop them. He's different, I whispered. I don't know who he is anymore. Caleb exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair. I overheard something at the hospital. He admitted. A few months ago, Daniel was talking to someone on the phone. He didn't know I was in the next room. He said something about needing money, about a plan. I didn't think much of it at the time. But, he trailed off, watching me carefully. But now? I prompted. His voice turned grim. Now, I think he's dangerous. The last piece of the puzzle. I wanted to believe Caleb was overreacting. I wanted to believe Daniel was still the man I married. But everything changed the day I found the hidden envelope. It was late afternoon when I was tidying up Daniel's office. A stack of documents sat haphazardly on his desk. As I reached to organize them, an unsealed envelope slipped out. Something told me to open it. Inside, I found a plane ticket. A one-way ticket to Mexico. For Daniel and another woman. And there, on top of the ticket, was a life insurance policy with my name on it. It felt like the ground had vanished beneath me. Everything clicked in that moment. Daniel wasn't just planning to leave. He was planning to get rid of me. My hands trembled as I placed the envelope back exactly as I found it. My heartbeat pounded so hard I could hear it in my ears. I had to act normal. I couldn't let him suspect that I knew. I had to protect Oliver. And most importantly, I had to get out before it was too late. The storm had been building for months. But now, I could feel it on the horizon. And I was running out of time. Saturday morning arrived, crisp and bright, as sunlight filtered through the tall oak trees lining our quiet street. The air was filled with the distant sounds of children playing, a reminder of how normal the world outside still was. But inside our house, something felt off. Daniel had been unusually quiet all morning, pacing in his office, making hushed phone calls. I couldn't hear the exact words, But his tone was sharp. Calculated. By now, I had stopped pretending everything was okay. I had seen the hidden envelope, the one with his one-way ticket to Mexico. The life insurance policy in my name. And the evidence of another woman. I knew. And now, my husband had started watching me the way a predator watches its prey. I tried to act normal, carrying out my usual Saturday routine. But I was hyper-aware of every detail. The way his fingers tapped impatiently against the counter. The way he checked his watch every few minutes. The way he barely touched his breakfast. Then, just before noon, Daniel did something that sent my fear spiraling into full-blown terror. "I'll cook dinner tonight," he announced suddenly. I nearly dropped the cup of coffee in my hands. Daniel, cooking? In our 12 years of marriage, he had never set foot in the kitchen. Not once. And now, out of nowhere, he wanted to prepare a special dinner? I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to remain steady. "That's nice," I murmured, pretending to be absorbed in wiping the counter. Behind me, I felt his gaze linger on me for just a second too long. A meal made for murder. The hours ticked by, agonizingly slow. At 6:30 p.m., I picked up Oliver from soccer practice. He was in high spirits, chatting excitedly about his game. About how Uncle Caleb had promised to take him to a real MLS match soon. But my mind was elsewhere. When we pulled into the driveway, my stomach twisted. The warm glow of the dining room lights seeped through the curtains. The scent of roasted garlic and herbs drifted through the air. Inside, the dining table had been set perfectly, a new, expensive tablecloth, polished silverware, wine glasses filled with red Merlot. And in the kitchen, Daniel was cooking. He moved with deliberate precision, chopping, stirring, checking the oven temperature. He followed a recipe, his eyes darting to his phone occasionally. But what struck me the most was the way he kept glancing at the clock. Every 3 minutes, my hands felt clammy as I helped Oliver with his school bag. Stealing glances at Daniel's movements. Something wasn't right. He plated the food with unnatural care, setting down grilled salmon, asparagus, and freshly baked bread, a side of rich, creamy soup steamed in a beautiful porcelain bowl. New England clam chowder. I stared at it, my heartbeat hammering against my ribs. Why this dish? Why something that could so easily mask an unusual taste? "Go ahead," Daniel said smoothly, his voice calm, almost too calm. "It's a special night." Oliver, completely unaware of the silent battle waging in my head, grinned. "This looks amazing, Dad." He lifted a spoonful of soup to his lips. Panic shot through me like ice. I grabbed his wrist just before the spoon touched his mouth. "Wait," I said quickly. Both Daniel and Oliver looked at me, startled. I forced a smile. "We should make a toast first." Daniel's eyes flickered with something unreadable. But then he smiled. "Of course," he said, raising his glass of wine. I watched his every movement as I lifted my spoon, pretending to take a sip of the soup. I let the warm liquid touch my lips but didn't swallow. It was smooth, salty, and then, a strange bitterness lingered on my tongue. A chill ran down my spine. It was poisoned, the first sign of danger. 10 minutes passed. Oliver's happy chatter filled the air as he ate. Oblivious. Daniel? He barely touched his food. Instead, he kept watching me, watching, waiting, and then, it happened. Oliver suddenly frowned, his spoon dropping onto his plate with a small clang. "Mom, I don't feel so good." My blood turned to ice. "No." I turned to my son, my vision suddenly feeling strange, distorted. A wave of dizziness hit me like a freight train. My hands went numb. The world tilted. I tried to stand, but my knees buckled, sending me crashing to the floor. Beside me, Oliver collapsed, too. A whimper escaped his lips. "Mom, help?" And then, I saw Daniel, still sitting, still watching. He didn't rush to help us. He didn't panic. He just observed. And at that moment, I realized, this was exactly what he had planned. The ultimate betrayal. I had seconds to decide what to do. I forced my body to go limp, closing my eyes, slowing my breathing. Next to me, I felt Oliver shaking, his tiny hand gripping my sleeve in fear. But he understood, he mimicked me. Through my barely cracked eyelids, I saw Daniel pull out his phone. He pressed it to his ear. speaking in a low, detached voice. "Yes," he murmured. "It's done. They'll both be gone soon." A pause. "No, no mistakes. The effect is certain." My pulse thundered in my ears. I had known he was hiding something. I had known he was lying. But I never thought it would come to this. My husband had just tried to kill us. And he thought he had won. But he had made one fatal mistake. We were still alive, and I was about to make sure that he paid for what he had done. No one would die tonight. Not if I could stop it. Lying on the cold hardwood floor, I kept my breathing slow and steady, forcing my body to remain still. My mind was spinning, battling against the numbness creeping through my limbs. I couldn't move. I couldn't scream. Next to me, Oliver's small fingers gripped my sleeve in terror. He was shaking, but he didn't make a sound. My brave boy understood. He was mimicking me, pretending to be unconscious. Above us, the soft hum of the chandelier filled the silence. The candlelight flickered, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Everything about this moment should have been normal. A quiet dinner, a cozy home, a loving family. But the truth was far from normal. Daniel had poisoned us. And he was watching, waiting. I could feel his presence, lingering near the dining table. The sound of his wine glass clicking against the wood echoed in the stillness. Then, his phone rang. A low, controlled voice. A voice I no longer recognized. "Yes," Daniel said smoothly. "It's done. They won't be a problem anymore." His words felt like a blade slicing through my chest. This wasn't just a moment of rage or a desperate mistake. He had planned this. Every detail. From the clothes we wore to the wine we drank. To the food that was meant to end our lives. I bit my tongue hard to stop myself from reacting. If he suspected we were still conscious, he'd make sure we never woke up again. Outside, the soft hum of traffic on the Charleston streets continued as if nothing was wrong. As if there wasn't a murderer standing over his wife and child, waiting for them to die. The clock was ticking. Daniel moved away from the dining room, his footsteps retreating down the hallway toward his office. Then, a familiar sound. The shredder. He was destroying evidence. I forced myself to count my breaths, to push through the dizziness. My phone was still on the table. If I could just reach it. But it was too risky. Then I remembered, I had left the voice recording app running. Everything was being recorded. His confession, his phone call, his betrayal. I tightened my grip on Oliver's hand, pressing it slightly to let him know I was still here. He responded with the faintest squeeze. Good. He understood. We had to wait for the right moment. A sudden distraction. For the next 15 minutes, we lay there, motionless. My pulse pounded in my ears as I listened to Daniel packing his bags, rummaging through drawers. Was he running? Or was he planning to finish the job? Then, out of nowhere, the doorbell rang. The chime sliced through the silence like a gunshot. Daniel's footsteps stopped abruptly. A second later, they hurried toward the front door. "Who the hell?" he muttered under his breath. I heard the sound of the door unlocking, creaking open. Then a voice. "Daniel, why the hell aren't you answering my calls?" My breath caught in my throat. "Caleb." I barely stopped myself from gasping out loud. Daniel's voice wavered, his usual smooth control shaken for the first time tonight. "Caleb, what are you doing here?" "I've been trying to reach Emily. She isn't answering. Where is she?" Silence. I could only imagine Daniel's face twisting into a mask of fake concern. "She's resting," Daniel said after a moment. "She wasn't feeling well, so I put her to bed." Liar. I wanted to scream, to run, to warn Caleb not to step inside. But before I could do anything, I heard another voice. Not just Caleb's. More voices. Multiple footsteps. My chest clenched. He didn't come alone. Then, the next words sent a jolt of hope crashing through my veins. "Daniel," Caleb said, his voice dark and firm. "Step aside. Charleston PD is with me." The moment of truth. The second I heard those words, I made my move, ignoring the wave of nausea rolling through me. I sat up abruptly, gasping for air. Oliver did the same, clutching my arm in terror. His face was pale, but he was alive. Daniel's head snapped toward us from the doorway. And for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw it. Fear. Pure, unfiltered fear on his face. I reached toward the dining table, grabbing my phone with shaking hands. The screen was still glowing. The voice recording app was running. Every word was captured. Daniel knew. His entire plan, exposed. I forced myself to stand, gripping Oliver protectively as I faced my husband. My murderer. Caleb stepped inside at that moment, his eyes widening as he saw me and Oliver. His face hardened instantly. Jesus Christ, Emily? Call an ambulance. I rasped. He poisoned us. 2 uniformed police officers pushed past Caleb, stepping between me and Daniel. For the first time, my husband didn't know what to do. His mouth opened, but no words came out. Then, a sudden vibration filled the room. Daniel's phone was ringing in his pocket. I didn't need to see the screen to know who it was. The woman he planned to run away with. Sophie Lane. The final nail in his coffin. Caleb took a slow step forward. We know everything, he said coldly. The money, the plan, the affair, all of it. Daniel took a step back. And then, he ran. For the door. For freedom. For an escape that was never going to come. One of the officers moved faster, grabbing him by the arm and slamming him against the wall. The sound of metal handcuffs snapping shut was the most satisfying noise I had ever heard. As Daniel was pulled away, he finally looked at me, and the only thing I saw in his eyes was hatred. Not regret, not fear of what he had done. Just pure, unfiltered hatred. But it didn't matter anymore. He had lost, and we were still alive. No one was dying tonight. The moment the handcuffs snapped shut, a strange silence filled the room. It was the kind of silence that came after a storm, the eerie stillness before the weight of reality set in. My husband, the man I had loved for over a decade, the father of my child, was being dragged away in handcuffs. And he deserved it. Oliver clung to me, his small hands shaking, his breath uneven. His innocent mind was still trying to process the nightmare we had just survived. My body felt weak, my limbs still trembling from the poison Daniel had laced into our food. I knew I needed medical attention, but right now, my only focus was holding onto my son. Daniel struggled against the officer's grip, his face twisted with pure fury. You ruined everything, he spat, his voice venomous. His cold, detached mask had finally shattered. I held his gaze, my heart hammering inside my chest. But I refused to look away. No, I said, my voice hoarse but steady. You did. The officers pulled him toward the door. But before they could take him away, his phone buzzed again, the final piece of his betrayal. One of the officers reached into his pocket and pulled it out. The screen was still glowing with an incoming call. And there, as clear as daylight, was the name flashing across the screen. Sophie Lane. The air in the room turned suffocating. Oliver stiffened against me, confused. Caleb's expression darkened. And Daniel? For the first time, he looked afraid. Not afraid of getting caught. Not afraid of what he had done. He was afraid because now, there was no denying the truth. Unmasking the monster. A slow realization crept over me. The late nights, the expensive gifts, the coldness, the secret calls. It had never been about Margaret's inheritance. It had never been about grief. It had always been about her. I stared at the phone screen, at the name of the woman he was willing to kill his own family for. Bile rose in my throat. Answer it, I said, my voice ice cold. One of the officers put the phone on speaker. For a second, there was only silence, then a woman's voice filled the room. Daniel, is it done? When are we leaving? The words sent a chill down my spine. It was planned. All of it. The poisoning, the escape, the betrayal. It wasn't just Daniel's plan. It was hers, too. Caleb clenched his fists. His entire body tensed with rage. The officers exchanged a look. Then one of them responded into the phone. Ms. Lane, this is Officer Daniels from Charleston PD. Daniel is under arrest for attempted murder. A sharp gasp came from the other end. Click. She hung up. But it was too late. They had everything they needed. The weight of the truth. As the officers escorted Daniel out the door, I felt a strange mix of emotions wash over me. Relief, rage, heartbreak, but most of all, closure. Oliver clutched my arm, his voice barely a whisper. Mom, Dad tried to hurt us. Hearing the words out loud made my chest tighten. I crouched down, cupping his face in my hands. "I know, sweetheart," I whispered, fighting back tears, "but he won't hurt us anymore. I promise." And this time, I knew I was telling the truth. Outside, the glow of police lights flickered against the windows. The neighbors had begun to gather, their hushed whispers carrying through the night. But I didn't care. I only cared about the fact that we were alive. Daniel had spent months planning to destroy us. He had poured every ounce of his energy into erasing our existence. But in the end, he was the one who had lost everything. The final goodbye. As they shoved Daniel into the back of the police car, he turned his head one last time. His eyes locked onto mine, dark and filled with unspoken rage. There was no remorse, no regret, just hatred. He leaned forward slightly, as if to say something, one final manipulation, one last attempt to twist the knife deeper. But I didn't give him the satisfaction. I reached for Oliver's hand, squeezing it gently. Then, without another word, I turned my back on Daniel. I walked away, and I didn't look back. Not this time, not ever again. The air felt different now. For the first time in months, I could breathe without the weight of fear crushing my chest. The past weeks had been a blur of police interrogations, hospital visits, and sleepless nights filled with nightmares. But tonight, standing under the golden rays of the Charleston sunset, I finally felt a sense of peace. Oliver ran ahead of me across Hampton Park, the cool autumn breeze ruffling his hair. His laughter rang through the air, pure, untainted by fear, untouched by the horrors we had escaped. Caleb stood beside me, hands in his pockets, watching Oliver with a soft smile. "He looks happy," he said. I nodded, swallowing past the lump in my throat. "He deserves to be." It had been a month since Daniel's arrest, since our near-death experience at that dinner table, since my world had come crashing down, only to rebuild itself from the ashes. A month since I had looked into my husband's eyes for the last time. And walked away. Justice and consequences. Daniel's trial had been swift. The evidence against him was overwhelming, the recorded confession, the life insurance policy, the plane ticket to Mexico with Sophie Lane. His fate was sealed before he even stepped into the courtroom. Attempted murder, financial fraud, conspiracy to flee the country. And as if karma wasn't done with him, Sophie, his so-called partner in crime, turned on him instantly. She cut a deal, throwing him under the bus in exchange for a reduced sentence. Her testimony had been the final nail in his coffin. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to. I didn't need to see the man who had tried to murder me and my son dragged away in an orange jumpsuit. I didn't need to hear him make excuses or watch him pretend to be the victim. Because Daniel no longer mattered. He was a ghost of a past I was ready to leave behind. Letting go of the past. The inheritance money that had started this nightmare had been donated to a scholarship fund in Margaret's name. Daniel had fought so hard for wealth and power, and now, none of it belonged to him. The irony wasn't lost on me. I still ran my flower shop, the secret garden, but something had changed. I had changed. For years, I had been the quiet, devoted wife, the woman who ignored the red flags, who believed in second chances. But I was no longer that woman. I was stronger now, sharper. I had survived something unspeakable. And I refused to live in fear ever again. I had learned that family isn't about blood. Family is about who stays when everything falls apart. And Caleb, despite having every reason to walk away, never left. A question I wasn't ready for. As Oliver kicked the soccer ball toward Caleb, he suddenly turned back to me. "Mom?" "Yes, sweetheart?" He hesitated for a second, then asked the one question I had been dreading. "Are you still scared of Dad?" The park around us grew quiet. I knew this question had been building inside him. I took a slow breath, choosing my words carefully. I knelt in front of him, brushing a stray lock of hair from his forehead. "No," I said finally, my voice steady. He blinked up at me, waiting. "I'm not scared," I continued, "because we have real family. You, me, and Uncle Caleb, and no one will ever hurt us again." A small, relieved smile spread across his face. And at that moment, I knew we were finally free. A future without shadows. That night, as I locked up the flower shop, I placed a fresh bouquet of white Casablanca lilies by the window. Not as a symbol of loss. Not as a memory of pain. but as a reminder of survival. The flowers no longer carried the weight of the past. They represented new hope, a new beginning. Our story wasn't about what we had lost. It was about what we had survived. And I knew, as long as I had Oliver by my side, as long as I had the people who truly loved us, we would always find our way, no matter what.